In video games, rules are everything. They shape how we play, how we win and how we lose. If your health reaches 0, it's game over. Spot the autosave icon in the corner of the screen, then your progress is saved. These rules are clearly defined, giving you a solid understanding of what to expect. But not all the rules we follow are written in stone. Some are invisible, learned instinctively through play. These are implicit rules, the assumptions we make based on our previous experiences with other games, or patterns that emerge as we play. Implicit rules often feel like second nature, shaped by years of gaming. For instance, think about the now infamous yellow paint or tape. It's not something games explicitly tell you to follow, yet over time we've learned to recognize it as a signpost for the right path forward. Or consider save points. Most players assume that saving means safety. You pause, you breathe and regroup, knowing nothing bad will happen. This isn't usually stated outright, but it's such a reliable convention that we barely even question it. Daryl Talks Games made an excellent video exploring how games sometimes break the assumed safety of save points. While Daryl focused specifically on save points, this concept opens the door to a broader discussion about how subverting player expectations can create powerful and memorable moments in video games. I'm sorry if that Dead Space scene made you jump, but back in 2008, this was the first time I played a game that incorporated such an effective pattern break. Dead Space was a game about refinement. It refined third-person survival horror, diegetic heads-up display, and it pioneered dismemberment. But Dead Space is also a game about subversion, and that's what the workbench jump scare is all about. You see, throughout the game, every time you interact with a workbench, you're safe. No enemies can reach you. But then there's this one particular workbench that completely subverts that expectation. Right as you exit the workbench, a necromorph jumps you. This only happens once, but from that moment forward, every time you approach a workbench, you're just a little more on edge. When Dead Space 2 came around, it was bigger, more varied and more intense. The game brought a slight tonal shift from the first, leaning more into high-octane action while still maintaining the series' signature horror. It was undeniably Dead Space, and developer Visceral Games knew exactly how to get inside the player's mind. As I mentioned earlier, patterns can be established not only within a single game, but can also carry over into its sequels. For example, in Dead Space 1, the single-person elevator becomes a sacred space, a small confined area where, despite the ever-present dangers elsewhere, you're completely safe. Throughout the game, no enemies ever attack you in these elevators, which trains you to instinctively let your guard down during these moments. When stepping into Dead Space 2, you carry this expectation with you. For the first 4 chapters, the game respects this unspoken rule. Each time you step into an elevator and the doors slide shut, for a few fleeting moments you're safe. And then comes chapter 5. By now you probably know how this is going to go. You step into the elevator, just as you've done dozens of times before. The doors close, your guard drops, and then this happens. On its own, it's just a simple jump scare, but when you factor in everything the player has learned over the course of the 2 games, it becomes incredibly effective. So, we've established that the implicit rules can be set and broken across games in general, a genre, a series or a single game. But what about remakes? That brings me to the moment that sparked the idea for this whole video. A moment from the 2023 remake of the original Dead Space. But before we dive into that, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Manta Sleep. I know all this talk about horror can make it difficult to fall asleep, but Manta Sleep's got you covered. They make these awesome sleep masks of very stretchy material. They are 100% blackout, and they are very comfortable on the skin. Very breathable material, and you can also sleep on your side. They are great to use at home, but you can also use them on the road or anywhere else you'd like. I take my health quite seriously, and anything to improve my sleep quality is a win in my book. So a big thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring today's video. You can find my discount code to get 10% of your next order in the description down below. Now let's get back to Dead Space. And wow, did this remake impress me. Motive took everything the original did right and not only preserved it but enhanced it, drawing inspiration from the refinement of Dead Space 2. One of the standout overhauls is the Ishimura itself. The ship is now one giant interconnected level, unlike the segmented chapters of the original. And the following moment shows me that developer Motive truly understands what Dead Space is all about. In the original, completing a level meant stepping into the tram, which transported you from one chapter to the next. The tram was a clever way for developers to hide the loading screens between chapters. Because of this, it also became one of the few safe havens in the game. But in the remake, there's no need for loading screens anymore, so the tram now simply takes you from one part of the ship to another. And well, let's just say it's not the safe haven it used to be. Watch for yourself.
Malfunction. Please stand by.
As you can see, I was ready to defend myself, but I was never in actual danger. Even so, something as simple as the tram screeching to a halt adds a ton to the overall tension. What makes this moment even more brilliant is that a lot of remakes are cheap cash grabs, doing only the bare minimum. Dead Space, however, goes the extra mile, messing with the player's mind in an area that was completely secure in the original game. And this isn't just a scripted event either. There's a small chance of the tram stopping at any point during the game, with multiple variations of the scare. This clever design forces you to question everything you thought you knew about Dead Space, and the sense of unease is exactly what makes it so effective. The Dead Space games aren't the only ones that use your knowledge against you. The following moment in The Last of Us Part 2 takes the workbench jump scare from Dead Space 1 and builds upon it. It's the same basic premise. You upgrade your weapons at a workbench and get attacked. The difference is that the attack happens not after you finished upgrading, but right in the middle of it.
I got her! We're not going back, understand?
I believe this moment is more powerful than the one in Dead Space for 3 reasons. First, it subverts a mechanic established in the first Last of Us, where a workbench signaled safety. Second, it rips you out of a menu, an element considered safe in most games. But most importantly, this moment is foreshadowed through environmental storytelling. Let me show you. The first thing you'll notice is that the front door is locked. On its own, that's not too suspicious, but keep it in mind. Next, we enter through a small window into the basement. From there, we head upstairs to the main hallway. And as we open the door, we trigger a sound trap made of hanging bottles. This is our second warning. It might not mean much yet, but keen players will likely be on their guard. After looting, we head up the second floor and find a room that is in noticeably better condition than the others. And here's our third clue. The plants in the window are well cared for, indicating that people have been here recently. Finally, there's far more loot in this room than usual, so much that Ellie even comments on it.
Still filled with supplies.
One common complaint I've seen about these moments is that people sometimes feel cheated, that it all seems too cheap. However, by adding these environmental clues, the scare feels more earned and immersive. The idea of toying with player expectations isn't actually all that new. While I personally had my trust broken for the first time with Dead Space back in 2008, earlier titles had already laid the groundwork. Take the original Resident Evil 2 for example, a survival horror classic that used its signature door opening animations as immersive loading screens. In the first Resident Evil, these screens served just as a transition between rooms. And well, you can probably imagine what Capcom decided to do with this particular door in RE2. What a controller dropper of a jump scare that was. By that point, players who'd gone through the first game must have opened hundreds of doors, fully conditioned to feel safe. For Capcom to twist that expectation, completely evil, but absolutely brilliant. To my knowledge, this is the only loading screen in the entire Resident Evil series that isn't safe. But the damage was done. Anyone who played this back when it came out never looked at doors the same way ever again. Another game that plays with player expectations is Silent Hill 2, but it does so in a way that's more subtle and unsettling. James's journey is one of my favorite horror experiences of all time. It's a particular style of psychological horror we don't often see in video games. The game has many layers, and I feel it gets better with each playthrough. The reason I mention it in the context of this video is because of Room 209, also known as the Whisper Room. It's a room where, if you walk past a certain point, faint whispers can be heard. When I played this for the first time, I jumped out of my seat. But the amazing thing is that whenever you start a new playthrough, a random seed is generated that determines whether or not the sound will play. People say there's about a 50-50 chance for it to happen, though I couldn't find a reliable source to confirm that. Point is, if you play the game for the first time and don't hear it, you're in for a big surprise on a subsequent playthrough. Just when you think you know everything the game can throw at you, it hits you with this completely new scare in a room you thought was just a simple room. I realize I've only been talking about horror games, and I promise I'll give you 2 great examples outside of the genre. But I can't pass up the chance to talk about Condemned Criminal Origins. In Condemned, you play as Ethan Thomas, an FBI investigator tracking a brutal serial killer. Throughout the game, you use forensic tools to uncover clues, things like footprints, fingerprints, blood splatter and more. Once you've found a clue, you need to photograph it with your digital camera. It's a simple task, quick and easy, but it has to be done manually. And this is where developer Monolith introduces their own version of a pattern break. Take a look.
I believe you found Mr. Tibbetts. Image seems to match personnel file. It didn't come through properly though. Can you take a close-up?
Help me!
I absolutely adore this jump scare, because it happens so close to the end of the game. The forensic sections lull you into a false sense of security. They feel like moments of respite, and that's where they get you. Flawless execution. So, I promised I was done talking about horror games, and the next game is far from that. However, there's one particular moment in the original Modern Warfare 2 that scared a lot of people. It's interesting, because being from the Netherlands and only 13 years old when I first played it, this moment completely went over my head at the time. It wasn't until I read a forum post and its comments about this scene that everything clicked. I'm talking about the loading screen of the mission of their own accord. You see, before every mission, while the game is loading, you usually get a sleek briefing cinematic, with maps, 3D visuals, voiceovers, the whole 9 yards. But for this specific mission, it completely ditches all that, and instead just shows you this. The US Emergency Broadcast System. This is the system designed to let the president communicate with the public during war, major threats or other national emergencies. The mission takes place in a war-torn Washington DC, so it already sets the tone for the chaos and uncertainty civilians would feel at the start of a war. But there's an extra layer of immersion here, especially for American players who were playing on their TVs at home. Seeing the emergency broadcast system, something they associate with real-life disasters, almost breaks the fourth wall. And judging by the YouTube comments, it clearly got under the skin of a lot of players. At the time, I didn't fully grasp its significance, but now I can't help but admire how much this one design choice added to the mission. It replaced the usual cinematic polish with raw panic. Infinity Ward knew exactly what they were doing here. One studio that has been on top of their game for over a decade now is From Software. Their games have had a massive impact on gaming as a whole, thanks to a formula they've refined over time. By keeping the core gameplay largely the same, while carefully building on it with each release, they've created experiences that feel both familiar and fresh. As a result, From Software games are absolutely stacked with implicit rules by now. One of these rules is simple. When you kill a boss and see the game's victory text, the fight is over. From Demon's Souls to Dark Souls 3, this has always been the case. Then Sekiro came along and shattered all those years of trust in one single fight. Sekiro has a notably high skill floor, probably the highest of any From Software title. For many players, the first encounter with Genichiro feels like a brick wall, until you've properly learned the mechanics. It definitely was for me. After progressing a bit further though, I hit another wall. The Guardian Ape. I must have died over 20 times to this guy before I finally beat him. And there's our victory screen. But wait, why hasn't the fog wall disappeared yet? As I ask myself this question, the reality sinks in. We're only halfway there. A second phase wasn't new at all, but showing the victory message and then resurrecting the boss afterward took me completely by surprise. It was the first time this had happened across 5 of their games. The moment filled me with so many mixed emotions. First disbelief, then anger, and later I came to love it, because it did something truly unique. And that's what the whole video has been about. Every moment I've mentioned has stayed with me long after putting the game down. A well-executed pattern break is a powerful tool in the developer's toolkit, and it can create some of the most memorable moments a video game can offer. Hey, thank you for watching the video all the way through. What are some of your favorite instances of a pattern break? I'd love to chat with you in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, liking it and subscribing to my channel would mean a lot. A huge shout out to my Patreons for their continued support. If you'd like to join them, you can find the link in the description. That's all for now. See you in the next video. Peace!